The air inside the restaurant was thick and heavy, filled with a mixture of delicious smells and loud noise. It was a Friday night, which meant the place was absolutely packed. Every single table was full, and the small bar area in the back was crowded with people waiting for a seat. The lighting was dim, meant to look fancy and intimate. But mostly it just made it hard for the waitstaff to see where they were walking. Overhead, old jazz music played through speakers, but it was barely audible over the sound of clinking glasses, silverware hitting plates, and dozens of different conversations happening all at once. Maya moved through the chaos like a pro. She had been working here for 6 months, and she had learned how to slide between chairs without bumping into anyone, and how to balance 3 heavy plates on one arm. Her feet hurt, a constant dull ache in her arches from running back and forth on the hard floor for the last 6 hours. She wore a black button-down shirt that was starting to stick to her back with sweat and dark trousers that had a small stain near the hem from a spilled drink earlier in the shift. Her hair was pulled back tight in a ponytail to keep it out of her face, and a small notepad and pen were tucked into her apron pocket. She was tired. Her smile was starting to feel fake, but she kept moving. If she stopped moving, she wouldn't make enough tips to pay her rent next week. "Excuse me, miss? Can we get some more water over here?" A man from a foretop called out without even looking up from his phone. "On my way," Maya said, her voice bright but automatic. She grabbed a pitcher from a side station and weaved through the crowd. She was good at her job. She was fast. She remembered orders, and she knew how to handle rude customers without losing her cool. But tonight, the energy in the room felt different. It felt more aggressive. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe it was just a full moon. But people were drinking faster and getting louder. In the center of the room, there was a large round booth that held the loudest group in the restaurant. It was a mix of 6 men and women, all dressed in expensive suits and shiny dresses. They had bottles of expensive wine on the table, and they were laughing at things that weren't funny, their voices booming over everyone else's. They were finance people, or maybe lawyers people who worked high-stress jobs and liked to spend their weekends letting off steam by acting like they owned the place. The leader of this group was a man named Julian. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Maya's car. And he had that look about him, the kind of look that said he was used to people saying yes to him. He had loosened his tie and had one arm draped over the back of the booth, holding court. He was telling a story, waving his hands around, spilling a little bit of his drink as he gestured. Maya dreaded going to their table. They had been demanding since they sat down. They sent the soup back because it wasn't hot enough. They asked for extra napkins 3 times. They snapped their fingers at the busboy. But they were drinking a lot of wine, which meant the bill would be high, and hopefully the tip would be decent. She took a deep breath, put on her customer service face, and walked over to check on them. "Is everything all right here? Can I get you another round of drinks?" Maya asked, leaning in slightly so she could be heard over the noise. Julian looked up at her. His eyes were a little glassy, and he had a sloppy grin on his face. He looked her up and down, not with interest, but with a kind of lazy arrogance. He didn't see a person. He saw the help. We're fine, Julian said, waving his hand dismissively. He turned back to his friends to finish his joke, but then stopped. His eyes drifted past Maya, landing on the far corner of the restaurant. Tucked away in a corner, near the large windows that looked out onto the busy street, sat a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, polished black wood that gleamed in the low light. But mostly it just sat there unused. Sometimes, on busy nights, they hired a pianist to play soft background music. But tonight they hadn't. It was just a piece of furniture. A place for people to put their coats, or for a waiter to drop off a check. Julian stared at the piano for a moment. A mischievous glint appeared in his eyes. He turned back to Maya, leaning forward on the table, invading her personal space slightly. "You know what that is?" Julian asked, pointing a finger at the piano. "It's a piano," Maya said simply. She shifted her weight to her other foot, ready to leave. "Very good," Julian said, and his friends chuckled. "I bet it sounds terrible if you play it. Probably out of tune." "I wouldn't know," Maya said politely. "Can I get you anything else?" Julian ignored the question. He was enjoying having an audience. He liked being the center of attention, and he had just found a new way to entertain his friends at the expense of the help. He looked Maya up and down again, judging her by her uniform. "You don't know how to play," Julian said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I bet you've never touched a piano key in your life. Probably think chopsticks is classical music." One of his friends, a blonde woman holding a glass of white wine, giggled. Another man shook his head, looking amused. The air at the table changed. It felt hostile. Maya felt a familiar heat rise in her chest. It was the feeling of being underestimated, of being looked down on just because she was carrying a tray. It happened all the time. People assumed waitresses were uneducated, struggling artists, or people with no other ambitions. They didn't know that she had a life outside these walls. They didn't know who she was. "I can play a little," Maya said quietly. It wasn't a brag. She just didn't like lying. The table went silent for a second, and then they all roared with laughter. Julian laughed the hardest, slapping his hand on the table. "She says she can play a little." Julian mocked. "Come on. You expect me to believe that? You look like you're struggling to carry these plates, let alone read music." Maya gripped the handle of the tray she was holding tighter. She wanted to walk away. She wanted to tell him to leave her alone so she could do her job. But there was something about his tone, the absolute certainty that she was worthless, that made her feet feel heavy. "I took lessons when I was younger," Maya said, her voice a little harder this time. Julian leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. He sensed he had hooked her. He pulled a thick wallet out of his jacket pocket and fished out a crisp $100 bill. He held it up between two fingers, letting it catch the light. "I tell you what," Julian said, his voice loud enough for the tables next to him to hear. "I like a good bet. You go over there right now, and you play something. Not a nursery rhyme. Something real. Something complex. And if you can actually play it, this $100 is yours. Plus I'll double the tip on this bill." Wave the money in the air. "But if you stink, or if you refuse, you have to admit you were lying just to sound interesting." Deal. The restaurant around them was still buzzing, but people were starting to notice the commotion. A couple at the table next to the booth stopped eating to watch. The bartender, a guy named Steve who knew Maya well, paused while wiping a glass and looked over with a frown. He knew Julian was a jerk, and he could see where this was going. Maya looked at the money. Then she looked at Julian's smug face. She could see the reflection of the restaurant lights in his eyes. He didn't think she would do it. He thought he had bullied her into submission. He thought he was the king of this little world, and she was just a background character. She thought about her tiny apartment across town, where her electric keyboard sat, covered in laundry in the corner of her living room. She thought about the hours she spent practicing as a kid, the calluses on her fingers that had long since faded. She thought about how tired she was, how much she just wanted to go home. But then she thought about the way he laughed. Maya slowly reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her notepad. She placed it gently on the table next to the bread basket. Then she reached behind her back and untied the knot of her apron. The black fabric fell loose. She pulled it off, folding it neatly and placing it on top of the notepad. She was wearing just her black shirt and trousers now, looking less like a server and more like one of the diners. "Right," Maya said. Her voice was steady. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at his friends. She turned around and started walking toward the corner of the room. Julian watched her go, the smile still on his face, but for the first time that night, he didn't say anything. He watched her back as she weaved through the tables, moving with a purpose he hadn't seen before. The murmurs from the nearby tables grew louder as people realized what was happening. The room shifted. The focus was moving from the center booth to the dusty piano in the corner. Maya reached the instrument. It was silent there, away from the kitchen noise. She reached out and touched the lid. It was closed. She grabbed the edge and lifted it, revealing the black and white keys. They looked dusty in the dim light. She sat down on the bench. It was hard and cold. She took a deep breath. The smell of old wood and furniture polish filled her nose. She flexed her fingers, hearing a small pop in her knuckles. She looked out at the sea of faces. Some were curious, Some were bored, and some, like Julian and his friends, were waiting for a train wreck. But Maya didn't care about them anymore. She wasn't the waitress anymore. She wasn't the girl who needed the tip. She closed her eyes for a second, finding the silence inside her head. She remembered the music. It was always there, waiting. She placed her left hand on the low keys and her right hand hovering over the high notes. The restaurant was still loud, but to her it felt like the ocean receding. She was ready. She opened her eyes and lowered her fingers. Asterisk. The walk from the center booth to the piano was only about 20 feet. But for Maya, it felt like she was walking across a tightrope without a safety net. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back. Usually when people looked at her in this restaurant, they were looking for a waiter. They were looking for someone to bring them water or take their empty plates away. They looked right through her. But this was different. This was a heavy, expectant gaze. It was the feeling of being watched, judged, and weighed before she'd even done a thing. Behind her, she could hear Julian laughing again. He was telling his friends that he had her scared. She was probably going to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and run away crying. He was enjoying this. He loved having power over people, especially people he thought were below him. But Maya didn't turn around. She kept her eyes straight ahead, focusing on the instrument in the corner. The piano sat there like a sleeping beast. It was much bigger up close than it looked from across the room. The black wood was polished to a shine, reflecting the twinkling lights hanging from the ceiling. It was a beautiful, expensive instrument that looked completely out of place among the sticky tables and clinking glasses. It was sad, in a way. Most nights, it just sat there in the shadows, ignored while people talked loudly over it. It was like a secret the restaurant kept, a piece of elegance that nobody had time for. Maya reached the bench and sat down. It was harder than she expected, stiff and uncomfortable. She was still wearing her black work shoes, the kind with non-slip. Rubber soles that were good for rushing around on greasy floors but looked terrible with everything else. She wiggled her toes, trying to find a comfortable position on the pedal. The metal of the pedal was cold against the rubber sole of her shoe. She lifted the fallboard. The wooden cover that protected the keys. It let out a soft, heavy thud as she leaned it back. Now the keys were exposed. They were made of ivory, or at least a good plastic imitation, yellowed slightly with age. Some of them had small chips near the edges. Dust had settled in the cracks between the keys. It looked like nobody had played this thing in weeks, maybe months. The restaurant was still loud. The clatter of silverware, the shouting of orders from the kitchen pass, the roar of conversations, it all washed over her. She could hear Julian's voice rising above the din, making some comment about her leaving the apron behind. "She's going for the full dramatic exit," he shouted, followed by another round of laughter from his table. Maya took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of the restaurant, a mix of coffee, fried food, and expensive perfume. Underneath that smell, though, was the distinct scent of the piano, dust, wood, and old felt. It was a smell that took her back instantly. It was the smell of her grandmother's living room. It was the smell of her childhood before things got hard, before she had to worry about rent and tips and rude customers in suits. She reached out and hovered her hands over the keys. Her fingers were trembling slightly. Her palms felt sweaty. She wiped them quickly on her trousers. She felt a sudden wave of panic. What if she couldn't do it? It had been a long time since she had played seriously. She played sometimes at home on her cheap keyboard, but that was just for fun, just to relax. This was different. This was a performance. And the stakes were suddenly very real. She wasn't just playing for money. She was playing for her dignity. If you can't do it, just say so. Julian yelled from his table. He was getting impatient. The spectacle was dragging on too long for him. He wanted a result. No shame in admitting you're a waitress, not a musician. A few people nearby shushed him. Even if they were curious to see what would happen, Julian was being rude. He was breaking the unspoken rule of the restaurant. You could be loud. But you shouldn't ruin everyone else's meal. Maya ignored him. She closed her eyes for a moment. She blocked out the noise. She blocked out the lights. She imagined she was back in her small apartment, alone with the door locked. She imagined the feeling of the keys under her fingers, She remembered the piece of music she used to love, the one she played when she was angry or when she needed to feel powerful. It was a complicated piece. It was fast. It was aggressive. It wasn't background music. It was music that demanded to be heard. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were rough hands. Her nails were cut short so they wouldn't get in the way of serving food. And her skin was dry from washing dishes with harsh soap. They didn't look like the hands of a concert pianist, but as she flexed her fingers, she knew the muscle memory was still there. Her fingers knew the shapes, even if her brain was nervous. The restaurant seemed to sense that something was about to happen. The noise level dropped, just a little. It happened sometimes in a crowded room, a shift in the air. People felt the tension. The bartender paused again, holding a glass towel. The busboy stopped clearing the table nearest to the piano. The group at the center booth quieted down. Realizing that their taunts weren't working anymore, Maya placed her left hand on the low end of the keyboard, her fingers finding the deep bass notes. Then she placed her right hand higher up, ready for the melody. She didn't play a chord to test the sound. She didn't wiggle her fingers to warm up. She just sat there, perfectly still, her posture straightening. She wasn't the tired server anymore. Her shoulders went back, her chin lifted. She looked commanding. She could see the reflection of the room in the polished wood of the piano. She could see Julian leaning forward, a smirk still on his face, waiting for her to fail. He had the $100 bill in his hand, waving it slightly like he was teasing a dog with a treat. Someone else from the table shouted. Maya pressed down the first key. It wasn't a soft note. It was a sharp, piercing tone that cut through the ambient noise like a siren. It was an E-flat, low and dark. Then came the next note, and the next. She wasn't playing a song yet. She was finding the rhythm, setting the tempo. She struck the keys harder than necessary, making the piano strings vibrate with a force that rattled the wine glasses on the nearby tables. The sound was surprising. It wasn't the tinny, weak sound of an old, untuned piano. It was a rich, full voice that suddenly filled the room. The acoustic of the restaurant, designed to bounce conversation around, was now catching the music and throwing it back, amplifying it. The people at the nearest tables flinched. It was loud. It was aggressive. It wasn't the smooth jazz they expected. It sounded angry. It sounded intense. Maya's hands began to move faster. She launched into the introduction, a flurry of notes that tumbled over one another. It wasn't chopsticks. It wasn't a simple pop song. It was a storm of sound, complex and rapid. Her left hand jumped across the keys, laying down a heavy, driving beat, while her right hand danced intricate patterns on top. The reaction was immediate. A man sitting at a small table near the window, who had been scrolling through his phone with his headphones in, looked up in shock. He pulled his headphones off. A couple in the middle of a disagreement stopped talking and turned their heads toward the corner. The bartender dropped the towel he was holding. The music wasn't beautiful in a soft, gentle way. It was harsh and demanding. It filled every empty space in the room. It pushed against the walls. It was the kind of sound that you couldn't ignore. It grabbed you by the collar and forced you to listen. Julian's smirk faltered. He stopped waving the money. He put his hand down on the table and stared. The laughter at his table died out completely. They weren't laughing because they realized very quickly that Maya wasn't joking. She wasn't pretending. She knew exactly what she was doing. Maya didn't look at them. She didn't see Julian's face. She didn't see the other diners turning in their seats. Her world had shrunk down to the span of the keys under her fingers. She felt a rush of adrenaline that she hadn't felt in years. It was better than coffee. It was better than a tip. It was the feeling of being in complete control. She pressed the pedal down, and the sound swelled, washing over the room like a wave. She hit a series of chords that were so fast they blurred together. The sound was intense, almost frantic. It mirrored the chaos of the restaurant, but it gave it structure. It gave it meaning. For the first time all night, the clatter of the kitchen and the noise of the traffic outside seemed to disappear. There was only the music. It was loud, it was aggressive, and it was coming from the woman they thought was just a waitress. She played on, her fingers flying, the notes spilling out into the air. silencing the room one table at a time until the only thing left was the sound of the piano. The music grew faster. Maya's hands were moving so quickly now that they almost looked like a blur. It wasn't just the speed that was impressive. It was the force she used. She wasn't gently tapping the keys like she was afraid to break them. She was attacking them. Her fingers slammed down, driving deep into the wood to make the strings inside vibrate as hard as possible. The sound was huge, filling every corner of the high-ceilinged room. The piece she was playing was technically difficult. It required the left hand to jump all over the lower half of the keyboard, while the right hand played a complicated, twisting melody. It was the kind of song that made a pianist's arms ache after just a few minutes. Most people who learned piano gave up on songs like this because it was too tiring. But Maya didn't look tired. She looked like she was waking up. Her posture had completely changed. When she was serving tables, she often hunched over slightly, trying to make herself smaller, trying to stay out of the way. But sitting at the bench, her back was straight, her shoulders were wide, and her neck was long. She looked strong. She owned the space. The noise from the kitchen, usually a constant background roar of clanging pans and shouting chefs, seemed to vanish. It wasn't that the cooks had stopped working. They hadn't, but the music was so commanding that it drowned them out. The sharp, percussive rhythm of the piano cut through everything else. It was like a heartbeat that was faster and stronger than anything else in the room. People at the tables, closest to the piano, were physically reacting. A man near the corner winced as a loud bass note vibrated the water in his glass. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. She turned to her dinner companion and whispered something, but he just held up a hand, shushing her. He didn't want to miss a single note. The atmosphere in the restaurant was shifting from casual dining to something like a concert hall, though no one had bought a ticket for this show. The bartender, Steve, had stopped wiping glasses completely. He was leaning over the bar, his jaw slightly open. He knew Maya was nice, and he knew she was good at her job, but he had no idea she possessed this kind of talent. It was strange to see someone you see every day in a messy apron suddenly revealed as a master of a craft. It made him realize he didn't really know her at all. He felt a sudden pang of respect, mixed with a little bit of guilt for not asking her about her life before. In the center of the room, Julian was frozen. His hand was still resting on the table, right next to the $100 bill he had bet. He wasn't looking at the money anymore. He was staring at Maya's back. He looked confused. It was written all over his face. He had expected her to fail. He had expected her to be embarrassed. But she wasn't failing. She was doing the exact opposite. She was excelling in a way that made his own attempt to humiliate her look small and pathetic. His friends were silent too. The woman who had giggled earlier wasn't giggling now. She was watching Maya's hands with a look of awe. The arrogance had drained out of their group. They were just people now, realizing they had made a terrible mistake. The social hierarchy they believed, in the one where they were on top and the waitstaff, was beneath them, was being destroyed by the sheer power of the music. Maya hit a particularly difficult section of the song. The melody leaped from the middle of the keyboard to the very high end, requiring her right hand to cross over her left in a swift, fluid motion. Her wrists bent perfectly, her fingers curling just the right amount to strike the keys cleanly. There was no hesitation. If she missed a note, nobody noticed. She played with such confidence that even a mistake would have sounded like it belonged there. Her physical strength was surprising. Playing the piano is athletic. It uses the whole body. Maya was swaying slightly with the rhythm, rocking forward on the bench when the music got loud and leaning back when it got soft. Her feet worked the pedals, one sustaining the notes to make them blur together in a wash of sound, and the other cutting them off short to make them sound crisp and jagged. She was using the instrument like an extension of her own body. The sound was rich and full. Because the piano hadn't been played in a while, it had a slightly rough quality to the tone, but Maya used that. She made the music sound gritty and raw. It wasn't polite background music. It was music with teeth. It was aggressive and emotional. It sounded like she was pouring all her frustrations, all the tired nights, all the rude customers, all the worry about money, directly into the keys. It was a release. Every time she slammed her hand down for a chord, It felt like she was pushing a heavy weight off her shoulders. The restaurant was now nearly silent, except for the piano. The clatter of silverware had stopped. The conversations had died down to whispers. Even the baby that had been crying in the back booth had gone quiet, hypnotized by the rhythm. It was a rare moment for a place like this, 200 strangers all focused on the exact same thing. Maya's eyes were fixed on her hands, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She didn't need to think about them anymore. Her fingers knew the way. She was thinking about the feeling. It was a rush that was better than anything she had ever felt serving drinks. It was a feeling of pure, unadulterated freedom. For these few minutes, she wasn't the girl who couldn't pay her electric bill. She wasn't the girl who got yelled at for forgetting a side of ranch. She was a creator. She was in charge. She began to play even louder. The song was building toward a climax. Her hands were moving in opposite directions, the left hand marching down the scale, while the right hand climbed up, creating a tension that made everyone in the room hold their breath. It felt like the music was pulling a rope tighter and tighter, winding up for something big. A young couple sitting near the window put down their forks. The man reached across the table and took his girlfriend's hand. They weren't looking at each other. They were both looking at the piano. There was something incredibly human about watching someone do something they are incredibly good at. It was inspiring. It reminded people that everyone has a hidden depth, everyone has a secret talent, and everyone has a story you don't know. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He reached for his wine glass and took a large gulp, trying to wet his dry throat. He looked around the room and saw that everyone was captivated. He realized that he wasn't the main character anymore. The story wasn't about his bet or his money. The story was about the woman in the corner. He had tried to make a fool of her, but he had accidentally made her the star. He felt small. He felt the eyes of the room on him, knowing he was the one who had challenged her, and he shrank back into the booth, wishing he could disappear. Maya didn't care about him. She was lost in the storm of the music. She was approaching the hardest part of the piece, a run of notes that required absolute precision. She took a quick breath, tensed her arm, and let her fingers fly. The sound that came out was like a waterfall cascading down the keyboard. It was flawless. The energy in the room spiked. It was electric. People were leaning in, mesmerized. The bartender let out a quiet whoa under his breath. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of the music. It was a heavy, intense silence that pressed against everyone's ears. They were witnessing a transformation, a moment of magic in the middle of an ordinary Friday night. Maya wasn't just playing a song. She was tearing the roof off the place. The music shifted again. It wasn't just fast anymore. It was becoming loud, overwhelmingly so. The complex, running notes were smoothing out into deep, heavy chords that seemed to shake the floorboards. Maya was leaning into the piano now, her whole upper body swaying with the rhythm. She wasn't sitting politely on the bench. She was attacking the instrument with a kind of fierce joy that made the hair on people's arms stand up. Every time her hands came down on the keys, it was like a thunderclap. The sound wasn't just music anymore. It was a physical force. You could feel it in your chest. The bass notes were so low and resonant that they vibrated the tables. A glass of water near the edge of a table rattled, the tiny waves inside mirroring the crashing sounds of the piano. The people sitting near the speakers could feel the air pressure changing. It was an immersive experience. The restaurant had stopped being a place to eat and had turned into a vessel for the sound. The room was completely under her control. It was a strange kind of power. Usually in a restaurant, the noise is chaotic, 100 different private conversations happening at once. But now, there was only one narrative. 200 people were thinking the exact same thing. Asterisk, who is this woman? They were united by the sound. It didn't matter who was rich or who was working class. It didn't matter who was a regular and who was a tourist. For the duration of the song, everyone was equal. They were all just an audience, captivated by the raw talent exploding from the corner. The complexity of the piece was increasing. Maya's right hand was moving so fast that her fingers were practically a blur. She was playing trills, rapid alternations between two notes that sounded like beads of water spilling on a hot skillet. It was a technique that took years to master, the kind of thing that separated casual players from serious musicians. Her wrist was loose, relaxed, allowing her fingers to do the work without tiring. She made it look easy, which was the hardest part of all. Watching her, you might forget how difficult it was, till you tried to imagine your own hands doing the same thing. Julian and his table were the epicenter of the silence. They were surrounded by it. Earlier, they had been the loudest people in the room, full of bravado and cruel laughter. Now, they were statues. Julian's face had lost all color. He was staring at Maya, but he wasn't really seeing her. He was seeing his own mistake. He had tried to make a joke out of her, to use her as a prop for his own entertainment. But the prop had turned into the main event, and now he looked ridiculous. The realization was dawning on him that he hadn't just lost a bet. He had lost face. He had exposed himself as a bully in front of a room full of witnesses. The blonde woman next to him wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at Maya with undisguised admiration. Her drink was forgotten in her hand. The arrogance had been wiped clean off her face. The other men at the table were shifting uncomfortably, looking down at their phones or their plates, trying to pretend they weren't part of the group that had started this. They wanted to disappear. The social dynamic had flipped entirely. The man in the expensive suit was shrinking. The woman in the work shoes was larger than life. Maya's playing hit a bridge, section where the music softened slightly, but became even more intricate. The melody was haunting now, weaving through the heavy bass notes like a thread of silver. The change in volume was deceptive. It was quieter, but it demanded even more attention. People leaned in closer, straining to hear the whisper-soft notes. The contrast was breathtaking. One second it was a storm, the next it was a gentle rain. Maya was showing them the full range of emotions that music could hold. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story without words. It was a story of struggle, of hard work, and eventually of triumph. Her arms were starting to feel the burn. Playing at this intensity was physically exhausting. The muscles in her forearms were tight, and her fingers were beginning to ache from the impact. But she didn't slow down. She used the pain to fuel her performance. She pushed harder, channeling the frustration of the long shift, exhaustion of the city, and the specific, sharp anger of being underestimated into the keys. Every angry chord she struck was a reply to Julian's smirk. Every rapid run was an argument against his doubt. The acoustics of the room were working in her favor. The high ceilings and the hard walls made the piano sound massive. The sound bounced around, wrapping around the diners. Even the kitchen staff, who usually couldn't hear anything over the exhaust hoods and the shouting of chefs, had stopped what they were doing. The line cooks were peering through the small round window in the swinging doors. Their faces pressed against the glass, trying to see where this incredible sound was coming from. They heard it over the sizzle of the pans and the roar of the fryers. It was that strong. Time seemed to warp. The song felt like it had been going on for hours, yet also felt like it had just started. The audience was hypnotized. They weren't checking their watches or wondering when their food would come. They were suspended in the moment. It was a rare kind of magic that only live performance could create. A recording might have sounded perfect, but it wouldn't have had this energy. It wouldn't have had the tension of a tired waitress proving a room full of strangers. Wrong. Maya's face was glistening with sweat. A strand of hair had come loose from her ponytail and was sticking to her forehead. She didn't brush it away. She didn't move anything except her arms and her feet on the pedals. Her expression was intense, focused, almost fierce. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or clothes. It was the beauty of someone doing exactly what they were born to do. It was the beauty of passion. The music began to build again. The quiet, intricate section was over. She was heading back toward the loud, crashing chords. She started to play faster and faster, building the tension. The rhythm became driving, insistent. It was like a train gathering speed, chugging up a hill. The notes were piling on top of each other, creating a wall of sound. The audience could feel it coming. They knew the climax was near. The anticipation was physical. People were gripping the edges of their tables. The bartender was holding his breath. Julian sat with his arms crossed, his jaw set tight. He looked trapped. He knew what was coming. He knew that when the song ended, he would have to face the music in a different way. He would have to hand over that money. He would have to admit he was wrong. But for now, he could only listen. The music had taken away his ability to speak. It had taken away his power. He was just another listener, swept up in the tide. Maya's hands were a blur of motion. She was playing at the absolute limit of her speed. The sound was a roar now, a magnificent, overwhelming wave of noise that filled every cubic inch of the restaurant. She was pouring everything she had left into the instrument. Her fingers were flying, striking the keys with precision and force that seemed impossible. The room was vibrating. The glasses on the tables were humming. The air felt electric. She played one final rising scale, her hands running all the way up the keyboard, hitting the highest notes with a sharp clarity that pierced through the bass like a laser. The sound climbed higher and higher, getting louder with every note, stretching the tension to the breaking point. The entire room was leaning forward, waiting, holding their collective breath. It was the edge of a cliff. They were about to fall over. The final chord was not just a sound, it was an event. Maya slammed her hands down on the keys with every ounce of strength she had left. It was a massive, thunderous conclusion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The deep bass notes vibrated through the floor, up the legs of the chairs, and into the bones of everyone sitting there. The high notes pierced the air like a scream, and then her foot came down hard on the sustain pedal and she pulled her hands away from the keys. She didn't move. She sat there, her back straight, her hovering just above the keys, catching the last few drops of energy from the room. The piano was still singing, the sound echoing off the high ceiling, bouncing around the room, slowly fading away. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, the restaurant was held in that magical, heavy silence that follows a great performance. The ghost of the music hung in the air like smoke. No one breathed. No one moved. It was as if the entire place had been paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, the spell broke. It didn't start as a polite golf clap. It started with the bartender Steve, who slammed his hand down on the bar and shouted, "Yes!" That was the spark. Suddenly, the whole room erupted. It wasn't just clapping, it was a roar. People were standing up. Tables were forgotten. The couple by the window jumped to their feet, applauding wildly. The kitchen doors burst open and the cooks came pouring out, clapping their hands and cheering, their white aprons stained with sauce, forgetting the orders waiting on the line. The noise was deafening, louder than the restaurant had been all night. But it was a happy noise. It was the sound of surprise, delight, and pure respect. Strangers were high-fiving each other. A woman at a nearby table had tears in her eyes. The energy in the room had completely flipped. The tired, grumpy atmosphere was gone, replaced by an electric buzz of excitement. It was the kind of moment people talk about for years. Remember that night when the waitress played the piano? And Maya sat on the bench for a moment, her chest heaving. She was sweating, her heart pounding like a drum in her ears. She looked out at the sea of faces, stunned. The adrenaline that had kept her going was starting to fade, replaced by a shaky, overwhelming feeling. She slowly lowered her hands to her lap and took a deep breath. She stood up. Her legs felt a little wobbly, like she had just run a marathon. As she turned away from the piano, the applause got even louder. Someone whistled. A man in a business suit yelled, "Encore!" But Maya just shook her head with a small, tired smile. She wasn't a performer who needed an encore. She had made her point. She began to walk back through the restaurant. The path to the center booth felt different now. Before, she had been walking to her doom, enduring the smug looks of the customers. Now, as she passed the tables, people reached out to pat her on the back or give her a thumbs up. "That was amazing," a young girl whispered as Maya passed. "You're a superstar," said an older man. Maya nodded at them, murmuring quiet thank yous, but her eyes were fixed on the back of the room. She reached the booth. Julian was sitting there, and he looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was pale, and he wasn't looking at the cheering crowd. He was staring resolutely at the empty plate in front of him, refusing to make eye contact. His friends were equally subdued. The blonde woman was looking down at her phone, even though the screen was black. The man who had taunted Maya earlier was slumped in his seat, his arms crossed tight against his chest. The silence at this table was stark compared to the noise surrounding it. They were an island of embarrassment in a sea of celebration. They knew they had been exposed. They had acted like bullies, and they had been beaten not by anger or words, but by sheer, undeniable talent. The social hierarchy they relied on had crumbled. Money could buy a fancy dinner and a bottle of wine, but it couldn't buy what Maya just did. Maya stopped at the edge of the table. She didn't say anything cruel. She didn't gloat. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just stood there waiting, her presence calm and dignified. Slowly, Julian reached into his jacket pocket. His movements were stiff, jerky. He pulled out his wallet and opened it. He took out the $100 bill he had waved earlier. His hand was trembling slightly. He didn't look up. He couldn't. He placed the bill on the table, right next to the ketchup bottle. Then, remembering his bet, he took out 2 more hundreds and placed them down, making a small pile of cash. It was $300 total. It's a massive tip for a few minutes of work, but it wasn't really about the money anymore, and everyone knew it. Maya looked at the money, then at Julian. Julian was still staring at his plate, his jaw tight. He looked like a small man who had realized he wasn't as big as he thought he was. Maya reached out and picked up the money. She folded it neatly and put it in her pocket. She didn't count it. She didn't say thank you. Just gave a small, polite nod that acknowledged his surrender without rubbing it in. It was a gracious move, one that showed she had more class in her little finger than he had in his whole suit. She turned and walked away, leaving them to their shame. She walked back to the side station where she had left her apron. Steve the bartender was there, a huge grin on his face. "I knew you had it in you," he said, handing her a glass of water. "That was incredible. You have to play for us again." Maya took the water and drank it in one gulp. It was cool and refreshing. "Maybe," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Right now, I just want to finish my shift." She tied her apron back around her waist. The black fabric felt familiar, heavy. She picked up her notepad. As soon as the apron was on, she felt herself shift back into waitress mode. But something was different. She felt lighter. The secret was out. She wasn't just the tired server anymore. She walked over to her next table, a family of 4 who had watched the whole performance. "Hi there," she said, her voice warm and natural. "Sorry about the wait. Are you guys ready to order?" The father looked up at her, his eyes wide with respect. He didn't treat her like invisible help. Treated her like a person who had just done something amazing. "Take your time," he said kindly. "We're in no rush. We just want to say..." "That was beautiful." Maya smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said. She took their order and walked back toward the kitchen. The restaurant was buzzing again, conversations returning, but the vibe had changed. People were happier. The energy was lighter. Even the kitchen staff, usually grumpy and stressed, were smiling as they fired the orders. Maya had given the room a gift, a moment of magic, in the middle of a mundane Friday night, as she dropped the ticket at the pass. She glanced one last time at the corner booth. Julian and his friends were getting up to leave. They put their coats on quickly, rushing to get out of the restaurant. They didn't stop to say goodbye to the host. They didn't leave a review. They just wanted to escape the memory of their own arrogance. Maya watched them go. She didn't feel angry anymore. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She knew that every time Julian walked past a piano for the rest of his life, he would remember this night. He would remember the waitress he underestimated. She turned back to the kitchen, grabbed a tray of clean glasses, and headed out to the dining room. Her feet still hurt, and the shift wasn't over, but she was holding her head high. She had gone to work invisible, and she was leaving a legend. And deep down, she knew that no matter what life threw at her, no matter how many rude customers or long shifts she had to face, she would always have the music. And that was something nobody could ever take away.